Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some Justine's Farm cards using the new Justine's Farm collections from Spellbinders. They're a set of 5 different press plates. This is Cotton Ball. This is Daisy, the adorable pig. I absolutely love the face on the pig. And then we have Clover and love her as well. I have a thing for cows. I'll talk more about that later maybe. This is a BetterPress registration press plate called Farm Sweet Farm. So it has all the different elements there and you can create this little scene with it. And I love the fact that these have sentiments with them as well, which are perfect for each one of those press plates. This one here is Feathered Friends. So I'm going to start off with doing all of my pressing first, and then I will do my coloring. I'm doing all of this on Bristol cardstock. I plan on doing my coloring with Prismacolor pencils. So the Bristol cardstock is my favorite one for doing that. I'll be using several different colors of BetterPress ink for the BetterPress registration set, and I'm going to start off with that first. So if you've never done BetterPress registration, it has an acetate piece that shows you exactly where to place each one of those press plates to get a perfect final result. So the 2 ink sets that I'm using are Woodlands. That's the one that has mostly greens, and then the one brown pad. And then this is the Nature Tones ink pad that I'm using the blue in, and I think it's called French blue. So I put that plate for the sky on where it says on the registration. I inked it with that French blue ink pad and then put the clear plate onto my BetterPress base and ran it through my Platinum 6 machine. And then I put my next plate on and right away went outside of the BetterPress inks that I had already picked out. I'm choosing Vermilion Archival ink. I didn't have a red in the BetterPress ink, and this is for the barn, and I wanted to have a nice bold red barn. I'm doing 1 plate at a time for parts of these, but you could definitely do multiples if they don't touch each other or overlap each other, and if there's enough room between them that you can ink them easily. So I could have easily done, say, this tractor with the next one. I would have had the room, and I'm using the same ink for both of them. So I'm doing it one at a time because I was concentrating more on the individual piece and what color I was wanting to use than making sure to do as few passes through my die cutting machine as possible. So that one there was the tractor, and I wanted it kind of a John Deere color, so I chose one of the greens from the Woodlands set. And now I'm putting 2 different plates here. One has a tree on it and one, or tree and a fence, and one has something else and a little bush. So I start with the brown, and then I'm taking the green. I think this one is called Laurel Leaf. Not exactly sure, but it's the lightest of the greens in the Woodland set, and I ink the tree with it. I wanted to make sure that I had different colors for each one, and having these tiny pads does make it really easy to put different areas or to color different areas in different inks before running it through. When you're using large pads, and I often will use my distress pads with my press plates, it's a little bit more challenging, especially when there's some smaller plates there, to get it inked in different colors. So that's one reason why I do really like using the small plates, especially for small little areas. Next we have the cows, and I'm just using my BetterPress black ink there. Now when using the BetterPress plate, especially for tiny plates, often there's not as much magnetic pull as when you have plates right on the BetterPress base. So especially for the small plates, I do find they move around a little bit easier, but the outlines are very, very clear on the registration acetate piece. So if they happen to move, I just use my fingers on the side of the press plate, trying not to touch it on the top where the ink is, and I move it back in place. Now, when I'm using regular plates, if I don't get a clear inking, I will regularly ink the plate again and put it through. But when it comes to registration plates, I typically don't do that because they don't have as much magnetic pull, and because it's easier to move the plates, I just try to be as thorough as possible with my inking, so I only do it once. And then when it comes to the plates, I clean them with Archival ink because I'm using Archival ink on them. BetterPress ink is Archival ink, and then obviously that red one was an Archival. So I do typically clean my plates right away after using them. just to make sure that next time I go to use it, I am ready and have clean plates. The BetterPress ink does stain the plates often. I don't really worry too much about that. I'm not one that is worried about things being stained as long as they're clean. I'd rather it be stained and used than pristine and not used. For the next bunch of images, I'm using black StazOn ink. Now, I want to color this, like I said before, with Prismacolor pencils, and I know that black StazOn ink is effective with it and doesn't run with the Gamsol or bleed with the Gamsol. I wasn't too sure about the Archival ink, so I didn't want to test that with these images. So I'm just using some black StazOn ink, and I'm inking both the image as well as a sentiment. And for each one of these, I'm doing a sentiment as well as the image. The chickens have dies that cut them out as well as dies to cut out the sentiments that are included with that. So I just put them all on the Bristol cardstock, not really caring exactly what the layout is because I plan on cutting them out. Now I'm using some StazOn ink remover for the StazOn ink. I happen to have both cleaners. You likely could use the Archival cleaner for StazOn ink. Again, I just happen to have both of them. They're both a permanent ink, where they just have different formulations to them. Next, we're using the Adorable Sheep, and I love the fact that each one of these guys has some florals with it. So I'm going to play with those florals when I am creating the cards to take them to the next level, shall we say. And I really think those florals make them look extra adorable. So once I have them inked, all of these are done on that Bristol cardstock. I haven't used any other cardstock for the image pieces for any of the cards. And I'm doing all of these with that black StazOn ink. You could easily use a colored StazOn ink if you wanted, but I really love the outline or the black outline when I'm coloring. Now I'm doing the Clover, I think her name was. This one has several sentiments. This one also has a happy birthday that gets cut out. So the one sentiment I'm using here says Herd, it's your birthday, H-E-R-D. And then I'm going to do the happy birthday on a separate piece of Bristol cardstock and cut it out. So then I can glue that onto. I hadn't decided at this point if I was going to do it on the front of the card or on the inside. I end up doing it on the front of the card, but I love the fact that they're both in there and the fact that the happy birthday does have a die that works with it. You could easily use that die cut or that happy birthday with the die cut for a number of cards. Obviously, it doesn't need to just be used with the little cow. So now I have another piece of Bristol cardstock. I'm doing the happy birthday that I was just talking about. And then that first BetterPress registration has several sentiments to it. One, Farm Sweet Farm, which I absolutely love. It also has Home Sweet Home, but I thought Farm Sweet Farm was perfect. It's different, but it works perfectly with that farm layout. So with those images pressed, I'm going to use the dies to cut them out. Anytime I'm using die cuts to cut out press plate images, I like to tape those dies in place. I'm just using some Best Ever craft tape. And by taping them, I know that they're not going to move in my Platinum 6 machine and accidentally shift. So I run that through. Now, when I was doing my pressing with that StazOn on the Bristol, I pointed out, but I didn't actually mention it, I have a little bit of an ink mark here. And I noticed when I started putting some of the Bristol on my clear plate from a BetterPress that it was actually coming from my fingers. I'd gotten some ink on my fingers. So that's what I pressed those sentiments on one of those pieces so it didn't go to waste. But to remove that ink, I just used a sand eraser from Tombow. I will regularly use this if I happen to overfoil. And it helps to just take that top layer of paper off. If you look really closely, you could see a really slight hint of it, but it's not quite as prominent as it was before I used that sand eraser. So for this BetterPress registration image, I'm going to use my Prismacolors to color the image. I'm not too sure how much that Gamsol is going to affect the colored image though. So on that little scrap piece on the side, I've taken each one of the colors I used, just put the edge of the pad on that Bristol cardstock, and I'm letting that dry. I know I want to color this regardless, but I want to be aware of how much that ink might run because of the Gamsol. So by having it on a scrap piece of paper, I can experiment with that and not my actual image. So for coloring, the first color I used there for the barn was number 930 Magenta. The second color I'm using here for the sky is 1023 Cloudy Blue, and it's a very, very light blue. And for most of this, I'm coloring where the lines in the image are. This the images for this are very unique and just are kind of created with a bunch of different lines, especially for the sky and a lot for the barn. And I just wanted to add some color in between that. I'm not necessarily wanting to add more color. I'm just wanting to color those areas. Next, we have number 913 Spring Green, and we're just going to use this for coloring in the grass area. That grass from the press plate, it only goes in a few areas, and I wanted that entire area to be green. And by doing this, it just makes it nice and colorful, and you can really see that that bottom area is grass by coloring around it. Now I am still going to use my Gamsol and my paper stump to blend this around, and this particular image has, the ink from it has dried a lot longer than the scrap piece of paper. So when I go to test that Gamsol on that scrap piece of paper, it affects, or the Gamsol affects that ink a lot more than it does this background, because the background ink has had time to dry. So just be aware that if you want the ink to be affected less, let it dry for a good time. And by a good time, I want to say maybe a half an hour. Like, you don't have to do it for hours, but a half an hour is probably about how long it was between pressing this image and coloring it. I wasn't timing myself. I never time myself when I'm doing these things. So that brown color that I used there was 943 Burnt Ochre. And then this blue here is number 904 Light Cerulean Blue. I just thought that there wasn't very much variety in the blue in the sky, so I just wanted to add a little bit of a darker blue tone closer to the horizon, right going behind the barn as well as the tree. I'm not adding a ton of color. I'm just adding a little bit of shading, a little bit of dimension, and that way the sky isn't quite as flat as it looked before. So you can see that I do a really quick coloring when it comes to this coloring. I don't spend a lot of time getting a ton of detail. For this particular image, to me, the detail is in that BetterPress registration press plate, that image. So I'm just filling it in a little bit. So here is that scrap, and you can see how much that ink ran. So that's what I was expecting when it came to working with the actual image. But like I said before, it didn't run as much. Anytime I go between colors, I use a piece of sandpaper to sand that paper off my paper stump. I have a little bowl here that I've poured my Gamsol in, and you really don't need a whole lot. A little goes a long way. So I'm going to start with my barn, and I'm starting where the lighter colors are first, and then I go into where the darker areas are, where I want the darker color. I don't accidentally want to start with the darker color and then get too much color all over the barn and not be able to control it. By starting with the lighter areas, I can always go in and add a little bit more color if I want, but I'm not accidentally pulling color in from some of the darker areas. Then I use that sanding paper and cleaned off my paper stump, and then started working with the green from the grass. Now that sandpaper is 400 grit sandpaper. It's not super thick. It's just enough, or super coarse. It's just enough to get that top layer of paper off. I've done this enough to know that just a quick rub on the sandpaper is really all that I need. What you can do if you're not too sure if that color is off of your paper stump is you could use a scrap piece of paper or a scrap piece of whatever cardstock you're using. Often when I'm trimming down cardstock, I'll be left with little strips of it, and I will save that with the cardstock that I'm trimming down and use it for this exact thing. So I'll use it to test and see whether there's a color that I like for the image that I'm using, or whether I still have a little bit of color on my paper stump. I find those little pieces, they come in handy. I do that with my watercoloring as well. If I'm trimming something down and I have just a little strip of watercolor left, I'll put that in my watercolor drawer, so that when I am working on an image and I want to test something or see if the color is right, or do, like, say, sample colors, if I've gotten something new in, just to see what the colors look like, I'll use those little strips. For the roof of the barn, I thought it'd be neat to have like a silver roof for the top of it. So I used the silver Prismacolor pencil on top of that red, and I have to say, when I went and used the Gamsol with it, the Gamsol did dull it a little bit, so it looks like more of an older silver tin roof, but it still gives that barn a little bit of dimension. And then the last thing I did here was add some 928 blush pink to the nose and the ears of the cows. So here is my finished image. I'm going to tuck that to the side. I'm going to do all of my images first, and then I'm going to create the cards at one time all together. There's no point in having my Prismacolors out and then putting them away to assemble the cards, or moving them to the side to assemble the cards. I might as well color in all of the images. So for a lot of these, I'm using the same colors. I will occasionally bring in a new color for some of the images if there's something that needs to be colored that I haven't used that color before, but I wanted to keep the colors very, very similar. So this here is the blush pink that I used on the cow's ears and nose, and I'm just adding that to the pig. So when I first start coloring with these Prismacolor pencils, I go in with a very light coat over the whole thing, and then I will go in and press a little bit harder where I want some shading. So I'm going to do that around the edges of the face, a little bit more or a little bit heavier towards the bottom of the jaw and the bottom of the chin, because that's where there would be a heavier shadow. And then also on the body as well. I'll put a little bit heavier right below the face and a little bit heavier closer to where those flowers are. To add a little bit of extra stronger color, I'm using that magenta just on the inside of the ears and just a little tiny bit on the snout. Again, just a tiny little bit. In real life, it is quite stark against that pink. On the camera or on the video, it doesn't show up quite as stark as it does in real life, but when you go to blend it out, it's going to blend out nicely and it will tie in or blend into the pink really, really well. So then I use that spring green for the leaves. For the flowers for this one, I'm using that cloudy blue as well as that light cerulean blue. So I did the lighter blue for the whole flower, and then I just used the darker color towards the center just to add a little bit of shading. So when it came to coloring in the pig, I started with my clean paper stump, doing the light areas the same way I did on the background, or on that previous one, the BetterPress registration scene. I start with the lighter areas first, and then I go in with the darker shades around the face and around the body. I want to do all of the pink first before I get into the area that has the pink with the magenta. So I'm making sure to just do those lighter areas. And once those are done, I go in and spread out that magenta where I want it to go. I don't want to accidentally put a little bit of that where I want the color to be a little bit lighter. So again, I start where it's lighter and then go and work towards the darker areas. Then I clean that paper stump off, dip it in my Gamsol again, and go in and do the flowers. And again, with the flowers, I do the same thing. I start at the outer parts of the petals where that color is lighter, and then go in and do the inside part where the color is darker. When it comes to the leaves, these leaves are so tiny. I only used a single color of green. I didn't feel there was any need to add some shading to it. To me, the focal point here is the pig first, the floral second, and then the greenery kind of is a third thing. So I don't think the focus is there. You can always add a little bit of shading if you wanted to have a little bit more of that color in there, or if you wanted the leaves to have a little bit of a shadow to them, or some deepening to them. I didn't find it really necessary. So I noticed an area around the snout there that wasn't quite blended in, so I went and blended it in, but I hadn't cleaned off my paper stump with the green. It doesn't show up as much on the video than it did in real life. It put a little bit of a green smear there, but what I did was clean off my stump and then went into more Gamsol and just spread that out so it's not nearly as noticeable, and it's very, very minor. So next I wanted to add a little bit of stickles in the centers of the flowers as well as some of the tiny flowers. I didn't add any color to the tiny flowers. Again, they're just kind of fillers and not part of the main thing there. And then I added some glossy accents to the eyes as well as the snout. Now, you saw me there using a pin with my stickles. I do that with the glossy accents as well as my glue. I have a pin sitting on my desk on a magnet. I regularly get questions about how I keep my glue unclogged. And for the most part, I do. I have a fairly tight fitting lid, but I regularly have to use that pin with the glue because it's just natural. They get clogged a little bit, and by having the pin nearby and ready, I can use it on my glue bottle or my stickles or my glossy accents and keep them flowing. It's a nice thin long pin that came with my Barely Art glue, and I just keep it nice and handy. For the sheep here, I'm using number 1084 ginger root for the base. I wanted him to be light, but I didn't want it to leave it white. and I didn't want to shade it with gray. So I thought a nice kind of a creamy color would be perfect. Once I did that, I used the blush pink for some of the florals as well as the inside part of the ears. And then a little bit of that magenta to deepen the centers of those florals. Now, like I said before, I'm doing something with the florals at the end that's going to take it or give it just a little bit more dimension, give it a little bit more interest. So some of these things that I'm coloring are not even going to be seen. They're going to be covered a little bit, but I still want them covered or colored so that if you're looking at it from the side, you see that there's not just a plain blank flower that doesn't have any coloring to it. Next, we have spring green here for the greenery. And again, I'm not doing any shading with that greenery. I'm just coloring it with that spring green. Lastly, I use that light cerulean blue for some of the smaller areas of flowers as well as the eyes of the sheep. Then we can go in with that Gamsol and paper stump and blend it around. And once again, I'm doing the same technique for all of them. I start with the lighter areas of the animal that I'm coloring in, then go into the darker areas, and from there go into different colors. So I want, even with each image, I want to make sure the lighter areas are done first so that I'm not accidentally getting the darker color into the lighter color. I'm trying to keep the image as true as I want it. Making sure to use that sandpaper to sand off any color off of my paper stump in between colors. So the technique itself is pretty repetitive, but it does work, or it does come together really, really quickly. The coloring is fairly quick. The blending out the color happens really quickly. So it doesn't take a really long time to get some interesting, well-colored images. And the glossy accents and stickles that I add, to me, it just adds a little bit of extra texture. I always think when I'm doing animals that it's really nice to have their eyes or eyeballs have that gloss to it. So the glossy accents is perfect for that. The stickles, I always love to add them to the centers of the flowers. Again, just putting something in that center of the flower, it adds a little bit of sparkle. So when you tilt it in the light, you see something catches the light, and it also adds that little bit of texture. Sometimes I find these images can be fairly flat. And part of that, in my opinion, is because I don't do a lot of really deep colored ink blending or deep colored shading when it comes to this. I'm fairly reserved when it comes to this, shall we say. I am not an artist in any way. I can absolutely color and I can watercolor. There's definitely, I've seen many examples of watercolor and coloring that are far more detailed than I ever do. So I'm not saying that I can't do it. I'm saying that I'm very modest when it comes to it. I'm not confident when it comes to doing a lot of extra detail. And for me, my satisfaction is the coloring itself. I don't necessarily want to do extra detail, shall we say. Here I'm using Canary Yellow number 916, and then after this I'm using number 1002 Yellow Orange for the little chick, and then for the feet on each one of the chickens. So when it comes to doing the coloring, you can do whatever is your comfort level, shall we say. For the chickens here, I kept them fairly plain looking. There are so many different variations. You can get really wild and get really creative with their colors. Here I'm using the magenta for the crown on the rooster, as well as the chicken. And then I'm adding just a little bit of light cerulean blue on the head as well as on some of the tail feathers. Once I blend this out, and I'm blending out that blue last, it ends up giving it a little bit more of a gray or silver tone to it, which is really, really interesting that it ended up doing that. I mean, chickens and roosters, like I said before, come in many different color variations, and you can really go wild and you can really have fun with it. I chose to keep them fairly simple. For this particular collection, my favorite ones to color were the cow as well as the pig. I don't know why, but that pig face to me was absolutely adorable. And I meant to say this at the beginning of the video. I grew up on a hobby farm, so I am fairly familiar with many of these animals. We never had sheep though. We did have goats. I went through a phase as well where I was absolutely obsessed with cows, although we had Holsteins. So they're the ones with the big black and white spots to them. And in my teenage years, I was huge into collecting cow stuff, especially cow kitchen stuff. I was convinced I was going to have a kitchen with all black and white. It was going to be cow themed. My first vehicle was a pickup truck, and I had cow seat covers and everything. I grew out of that by the time I actually got married and had my own kitchen. But I absolutely love the cow print and Holstein cows. This one's more of a Highland one, but I absolutely love, well, I have a thing for cows. And my parents still live on that hobby farm, but they don't have cows anymore. My dad and brother raise llamas. So it's a different hobby farm than what I grew up with. So here is the Highland cow. I started off with ginger root, which is the same color that I did the sheep in. And then I went in with that burnt ochre and did the outside part of the shading part of it. I didn't want to make him too dark. And I was trying to keep my color choices fairly simple and fairly limited. I didn't want to add 100 colors to this. I didn't want to have everything all different colors. However, I think these would be fantastic if you got really bright and creative with the coloring to them, as well as bright and creative with the color for the florals. I think that would really make them pop as well. I did the same colors for the horns. I did that ginger root as well as a little bit of burnt ochre for the shading. Then going in with some spring green for the leaves, and then the florals, again, same with the rest of the florals, blush pink as well as some magenta for the centers of those flowers. The blue, there's some little clusters of florals. They almost look like a bunch of hydrangeas. I'm not really sure what they're supposed to be, but I did those in the blue, and I really love the look with that pink and the blue flowers to them. Now we're going to go in and do the blending, and just like all of the others, I'm starting in with the light color first, blending that out as much as possible, and then going in to do the darker areas, the darker shading. Trying to make sure to use that sandpaper to clean off my blending stump in between the different colors. And obviously I chose to use the Prismacolor pencils for coloring here. You can color them however you want. I think these would be fantastic for watercolor, and I do plan and intend to use watercolor with them in the near future. Especially this guy. I'm obsessed with him. Her, going by the name, it's a her, and the pig. I don't know what it is between those two, and I think it's their faces. Once the face and body is done, I can go in and do the florals, again making sure to clean off that paper stump before or between each and every single color. Now I have kind of a medium-sized paper stump here. They come in a lot smaller and finer, and they also come in really big chunky ones. You can pick and choose which size you feel comfortable with. I have a variety of sizes, or I bought a package with a variety of sizes in there, and I just kind of chose the medium-sized one. But for tiny areas, using a smaller one might be beneficial or might be helpful. Once that image is done, once again, going in with the stickles as well as the glossy accents. Now, at this point, when I'm doing this with the stickles and glossy accents, my reasoning was I had planned, or I knew I was going to have a time where they could sit and dry for at least an hour. But I didn't know, I was planning on trimming this down, but I end up deciding to die cut it. And I would opt, if you're going to do the same die cutting as I am, or as I do, I would choose to do that glossy accents after doing the die cutting, simply because even if it's completely dry, just the pressure from the plates will just dull the finish a little bit. And you can easily add another coat to gloss it up again, but then you have to do that same step twice. So by waiting until after it's been die cut, you can just eliminate that second step and having to wait for it to dry again. For die cutting these, I'm using the Perfect Touch Rectangles die set. So this is a rectangle die set, but they have little almost like V notches along the whole outer edge that just gives a fun detail. It doesn't cut V's into the cardstock. It's just a little detail that gets pressed into there, and it just adds a nice touch around the outside edge. For the mats around these pieces, I have used my guillotine trimmer, and I trimmed them down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and that frames them really quite nicely. Next, I'm going to add that Farm Sweet Farm sentiment, and I'm adding it to the sky. There's a nice big blank space there, so it's perfect for that. You could always put that on the inside of the card as well. So that BetterPress registration background, I didn't add any ink blending to that. I didn't find it was necessary, but for these rest of them, I'm going to add some ink blending to them. It's just going to add a little bit of extra dimension and depth to them. I also didn't add any stickles or glossy accents to that first one there. There wasn't really an area that I thought it would be perfect for, so I just opted to leave it. I'm using my sticky mat to hold my cardstock while I'm doing my ink blending. It's perfect for that, but I do want to make sure to clean off that ink from that cardstock before I use it for the next color so that I don't accidentally get that color in there. This one here is the chicken card that I'm going to create. I just chose some onyx cardstock for the background, and that same as the first card. All of my mats around the outside or around my image are trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and all of my image pieces are die cut using that Perfect Touch rectangles die, and I use the same size for all of them. The same size worked well for all of them, so I figured there's no point in changing the sizes, especially for the width of the heads as well as adding the sentiments. And it's the second largest of that set. It was the perfect one for all of it. So once I have my chickens down, then I can add my sentiment here. I chose again to put all 3 of the chickens on the front and the sentiment on the front. You could easily add that sentiment to the inside of the card. So this is where I'm going to change up the florals on the animals. I have the tiny florals with the little blooms die set here. This one came out in the summer. It just has some really nice small florals to it. You don't necessarily have to use this set for it, but I wanted to add some extra die cut florals to it just to add some extra dimension to these images. For both the pig as well as the sheep, I'm using some Shabby Shutters Distress Ink. Now, in hindsight, for that sheep, I probably would use a different color. I probably would say use the Stormy Sky that I'm going to be using for the cow, just because that Shabby Shutters is very similar, or it looks very similar in color to the ginger root color that I used to color the sheep, and it makes the sheep, in my opinion, look a little bit more on the green side because of that Shabby Shutters, as well as my green mat for this particular card. And this green mat was cut out of fern cardstock. So by doing it in blue instead, I think it would take that green tone off of the sheep. And this is just a personal observation. It's probably something that no one else really saw or noticed. But when I look at it after the fact, I just kind of see a green toned sheep. So my florals here, I chose some of the smaller ones, and I just die cut them out of some Fruit Punch cardstock. Then I'm gluing them over top of my colored flowers. Some of the larger flowers, I am using my fingers to shape them a little bit, just to give it a little bit of extra dimension. And this is something I do regularly when I'm using floral die cuts. I'm also going to take some ink and add a little bit of extra dimension to the center of those florals. So I'm going to use a detailed ink blending brush and go in with some picked raspberry distress ink, just again to add some darker area to the center of those florals. These smaller florals, I'll just touch them a little bit with that picked raspberry distress ink as well, for that same reason, just to give it a little bit of dimension. You could do the ink blending on these ahead of time. Originally, I wasn't planning on doing ink blending on the florals, but once I put them onto the image, it just felt like it needed a little bit of something, especially the larger flower. It looked a little bit flat. Again, I'm going to put some stickles in the center of those florals. And this is where it probably covered a lot of what I did ahead of time with my coloring. But when I was doing the coloring and had all those supplies out, it's much easier to have everything colored ready to go than have to go back in and touch something up. So for this card here, I'm using partly cloudy cardstock, and this is going to tie in beautifully with the florals because I've used the partly cloudy cardstock for die cutting the florals. Then we can glue on the adorable pig image there. And for this one, I did those glossy accents on the snout, and I really love how much extra texture and dimension it gives it. It really makes that pig come to life, in my opinion. For this one here, after doing the ink blending on the florals for the first one, I knew that I was going to want to do it on here, so I'm just using a detailed ink blending brush with the Stormy Sky Distress ink, doing the centers of those florals before adding them to there. I also have some greenery die cut as well, and that's die cut out of some fern cardstock. Again, these steps could be eliminated if you want, and they could be done with different floral or greenery die cuts if you want as well. I just think it just adds that little bit of extra texture, and I love the look of it on there. It ties in really well with the florals on there and covers some of them up, but it doesn't cover all of it. But you definitely, this is a step that you could easily eliminate if you wanted to. Now the pig image only had 2 florals. I am a girl that works by the rule of odd numbers, so I wanted it to have 3, so I just tucked a third one in there. Once again, going in with the stickles in the centers of the florals, and then I'll set all of them aside to dry, and I'll show you them at the end of the video once they're all dried. Lastly, we have the adorable cow. I'm going to use the Stormy Sky around the edges for this one here. I have a mat cut for it out of pink sand cardstock. I think this blue on here really makes it, or really makes the image of the cow come out. And this is the color that I think I should have done with the sheep. I think it would have brought the image of the sheep out a lot better than the shabby shutters that I did use. So once that is ink blended on there, and I'm using some large Spellbinder brushes to do that ink blending because they do a really great job with some light ink blending. So I don't have a lot of harsh color there. I just have like a whisper of color around the outside edges, and I'm not going all the way into the image. In my opinion, that's not necessary at all. Just adds kind of a halo around the image there, and I love the look of that. For this guy, I have some florals die cut out of the Dahlia cardstock as well as that pink sand cardstock. So I'm using the pink or picked raspberry for ink blending the centers of the florals for all of them. However, I'm going in when the ink is the heaviest on the Dahlia cardstock, and then when it's a little bit lighter, I go on the pink sand. So I don't put too much ink on there. I still get some ink blending towards the center, and it's still vibrant compared to the color of the cardstock, but I don't want to go in with a heavy concentration of ink right off the bat. First, I'm going to glue down some of those florals, then or the leaves, and then I'm going to go in with the larger floral. The smaller florals are just to be tucked behind the larger one there. And I just think having the 2 pinks there really make that larger one kind of stand out a little bit more. I do, for the large floral, use my fingers to curve the edges of it just to make it a little bit more dimensional. You could also do that for the greenery, and for some of the greens I did that. Some of the greens I didn't even bother. Because these are just kind of touches on there, I didn't find that it was necessary to go all out with the florals. I just wanted to have them there for that dimension. I glued down that happy birthday sentiment and then put stickles in the center of the florals and then let them completely dry. So here they are after they have had some time to dry, and I love the look of those extra dimensional florals or the extra floral die cuts on top of there. I think they really just kind of take them to the next level and take them over top and add that extra texture to them. Then we have that adorable, sweet, innocent little pig there. This pig totally reminds me of Charlotte's Web. Every time I look at it, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. Then we have our sheep, and this sheep reminds me of the Tim Holtz images. I don't even remember what they were called, but they had glasses and ties and stuff like that. I don't know what it is about that sheep, but it totally reminds me of those guys. Then we have our chickens. And again, I put all 3 of the chickens on the front of the card. You could easily put a couple or even the chick on the inside of the card, put the sentiment on the inside of the card. So there's many options. And you can also just obviously not have all of them on one card. And then we have our BetterPress registration image, which creates a fantastic image for cards for people that love farms or a farm. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.